When a person realizes he's a spirit, that changes everything. So when a person has a spiritual identity, that is a big change from level 5. This is a person who might say, my honor is more important than my life. Want me to renounce my religion because the state is against religion? No, I'm not going to do that. Go ahead and kill me. And they kill him, and he's not upset because he knows he's a spirit. So the most obvious cliche in this regard is the Christians in the Colosseum. The Romans would bring them in, and these were the ones who said, oh no, I'm not a Christian. They would let them go. These were the ones who said, yes, I'm a Christian, and I wish you only the best. And then they would have them eaten by the lions. There are accounts of the Christians in the Colosseum, and they would be singing together. So they weren't terribly upset. Obviously, it's a scary thing that you're going to be shot by arrows or eaten by a lion. That's obviously a traumatic event, but they understood they would be going to heaven. St. Peter and St. Paul, like Jesus, had the attitude, I know who I am, and if you guys want to crucify me, go ahead. And they did. I am the discoverer of hitherto unknown natural phenomena, which greatly aid in the understanding of people, from which I constructed a revolutionary practical philosophic system called Septemics, and published it in the book Septemics, Hierarchies of Human Phenomena. Today, we're going to discuss some of the content of that book. The scale of spiritual identity. Every human has some spiritual identity, meaning everyone is on the scale somewhere. No matter what the person believes, he's on this scale somewhere, and you'll see that as we go through it. Now, this is a linear scale, which makes it easy to understand, meaning it's not a spiral scale. In a spiral scale, there's an apparent congruence between levels 1 and 7. That doesn't apply here. This is a quantum scale, meaning there is no intervening gradations. You're either at level 2 or level 3, period. There's nothing in between. And it's a general scale, meaning once you identify a person's level, whether it's yourself or another on this scale, you're done for that person. You can go to another person and identify that person on the scale, but this is not context driven. This is not about context. This is about the most basic identity that the person has of himself, even beyond being a human. In other words, this is spiritual identity. This is who and what you think you are. Now, what are we measuring on this scale? If we have a scale that's measuring something, this is the cause to effect scale. At the top of the scale, meaning above level 1, you have total cause. Below level 7, you have total effect. And as you move up, you go away from effect and toward cause. Of course, total cause for human is unattainable, as is total effect, which is why total effect is below level 7 and total cause is above level 1. Let's start at level 7. Now, before I do this, I want to remind people that most of the time, if a person has difficulty understanding its scale, it's understanding the extremes of the scale that they have trouble with, meaning levels 1 and 7, because very often that is not real to the person. They may have never seen that. They may never have considered that existed, but the scales are what they are. So you're just going to have to learn how to wrap your brain around these concepts. Level 7 is a person whose spiritual identity is an inanimate object. This person thinks he's a thing, not even a living thing, just an inanimate thing. Now, if you study ancient religious texts, they talk about divic entities, which are beings who often think they are things. It is a fact that there are beings who think they are rocks or grains of sand or a cloud. A being can think he's anything. Obviously, this is very close to total effect, because if you are a thing, you are at effect. If you think you're a rock, that rock will sit there for maybe 1 billion years. And if anybody comes along and picks it up and throws it, there's nothing you can do about it. That's your identity. So there are beings who think they are inanimate objects. Now, updating this a little bit, there's a lot of talk about AI. You could have what we might call a robot, and you could have a spiritual being that thinks he is the robot. That's his identity. But again, that would be a thing. It's not alive. Any questions before I go on?
In looking at this, it provides a perspective of detachment and objectivity because it allows you to observe the world without the biases and emotions that are often associated with the human experience, and can offer an understanding of the interconnectedness of things, because we don't see ourselves as an integral part of the cosmic tapestry, but it can also limit one's consciousness to being a passive observer devoid of agency and personal growth, because there's that disconnection. How does this state of consciousness influence one's sense of identity and agency within this universe?
A person at level 7 is at effect. I don't want to say he's at total effect because that's probably unattainable by a human, but maybe 99.9% effect. So this might be a catatonic schizophrenic who's in an insane asylum. He just sits there. You talk to him and he doesn't respond. He thinks he's an inanimate object. He does not even have the cognition of a dog or a cat.
We can't grow and evolve without agency or personal identity.
Yes, it's always possible for a person at level 7 to move up to level 6. At level 6, you think you are an animate object, meaning I define it as an animal, but it would also include plants. Many people have had telepathic interactions with plants. This is not that unusual. There are many people who can get into a rapport with a tree or something like that. There is a being there who thinks he's the tree. That's an animate object. It has more causativeness than an inanimate object. A tree can do tremendous things. A tree can, over time, rip up a pavement. It could also be a flower. So that's pretty far down as far as the consciousness that he thinks he's an animate object. Now, this is much easier to see in cats, dogs, and horses. Most people who are animal lovers can see that there's a being there. That animal has a personality. That dog thinks he's a dog. There is a spiritual being there that has that identity. I am Rover. That's the next level up. Any questions on that one?
I'm looking at it in the spectrum of for and against, because I can see that it fosters a deeper appreciation for the vitality and diversity of life. It recognizes the inherent value of all living beings, but at the same time, it can lead to a reductionist perspective where individuals may prioritize survival and self-interest over the well-being of other species, or at the expense of other beings and ecosystems. The question in my mind is, how can perceiving oneself as an animate object enhance our understanding of interconnectedness and unity?
First of all, I would say, remember, this is fairly low on the gradation from cause to effect. So a person whose spiritual identity is that he's an animate object is not very causative. A smart dog is like a 4-year-old kid, is the way it's explained by animal experts. How causative can that being be? Not very. He can't drive a car. He can't talk. Where that being is, he thinks he's an animate object, a plant or an animal. Okay, so above that is a persona. This is where we get into most of the human race. Most people, and I'm talking about people who might be described as unenlightened, which is the majority of the human race, think of themselves as a persona, meaning an identity. Who are you? I'm Joe. Or it could be something like, I'm the mayor, or I am a formidable opponent, or I am a smart guy. You can see that there's really no limit to how many personas could exist. The person has an identity. He thinks he's an identity. In other words, he's not up to really seeing that he's a spiritual being. He is identified with this persona. You see this in people who are unenlightened, who don't realize they are a spiritual being. For example, like professional criminals. Most of the people in prison probably think, I'm Joe Smith. That's his identity. He doesn't have any awareness beyond that. So he's causative enough to know that he's not merely an animate object, he's a persona. But that's not really having any type of a spiritual identity, notwithstanding the name of the scale. His identity is that he's a persona. You might have a woman whose identity is a feminist. That's where she comes from. That's how she thinks of herself. Any questions?
I see that can risk reinforcing egoic attachments and identities. That can lead to a sense of separateness and division from the collective. It may contribute to a superficial understanding, and to your point about criminals, a superficial understanding of the self, where the prioritization is external validation and social status as distinct from inner fulfillment. That could result in an identity crisis and existential angst because there's a struggle to reconcile their perceived self-image and their deeper spiritual essence.
I would argue that a person at this level doesn't have any conception of the spiritual essence. He's just an identity. They're not as effect as someone who thinks he's an animal or a plant, but he's not as causative as a person who realizes he's a spirit. Now you're getting into how useful this is. Because if you spot somebody as being at level 5 on this scale, that tells you thousands of things about this person.
Yeah.
You know what to expect from this person. This person is going to be out for himself. He's not going to help you.
There's an over-identification with the persona, and that can create an illusion of self that obscures the deeper truth of spiritual beingness beyond individual labels. There's a strong identification with the identity, which serves to reinforce the ego, leading to attachment and suffering as identities are challenged or lost. I've seen this in the corporate structure where you'll get someone who has an inferiority complex, but it's really clothed and demonstrated by a superiority act. This is really useful.
Really useful stuff.
Yeah.
You look at the person, what's this person's spiritual identity? It explains a lot about the person. One of the axioms of this subject is that when a person is high on any scale, it's because he has insight in that area. When he's low on any scale, it's because he lacks insight in that area. If you are down at level 5, 6, 7, the further down you go, you have less insight in the area of spiritual identity. But when you get to an inanimate object, you can't really have a discussion with that person. That's because it thinks it's an inanimate object. Now, some people will have conversations with dogs and cats. That exists at level 6 to some degree. So you see there's a little bit more causativeness there. But still, you're not going to expect more from a being who thinks he's an animate object than being an animate object. That's what he thinks. So you have to accept that about that person. And there are people like that. Oh, yeah, I'm just an animal. I think it was Plato who said, people are animals who can talk. So he's describing level 6. You'll bump into a guy at this level and he can talk. He just thinks he's an animal. And don't think because a guy has 150 IQ, he's going to have a high spiritual identity. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
So you have guys with graduate degrees who think, I'm just an animal. Now let's go up to 4. Here we get to your identity as a spirit. When a person realizes he's a spirit, that changes everything. Now, I use the synonym a ghost. It doesn't necessarily be a scary ghost or Casper the ghost. It's just a ghost is a spirit that is not in a body. So when a person has a spiritual identity, that is a big change from level 5. This is a person who might say, my honor is more important than my life. You want me to renounce my religion because the state is against religion? No, I'm not going to do that. Go ahead and kill me. And they kill him, and he's not upset because he knows he's a spirit. So the most obvious cliche in this regard is the Christians in the Colosseum. The Romans would bring them in, and these were the ones who said, oh no, I'm not a Christian. They would let them go. These were the ones who said, yes, I'm a Christian, and I wish you only the best. And then they would have them eaten by the lions. There are accounts of the Christians in the Colosseum, and they would be singing together. So they weren't terribly upset. Obviously, it's a scary thing that you're going to be shot by arrows or eaten by a lion or something. That's obviously a traumatic event, but they understood they would be going to heaven. St. Peter and St. Paul, like Jesus, had the attitude, I know who I am, and if you guys want to crucify me, go ahead. And they did. All three of them were crucified because they, at a minimum, understood they were a spiritual being. That is why the Christians could not be stamped out. The Christians had the attitude, go ahead and kill me, and I'll be in heaven. You really can't defeat a group like that. This is reminiscent of the kamikazes, who were, so far as I know, mostly Buddhists who thought this is an honorable death, and I will continue as a spiritual being after I blow myself up with this airplane full of TNT.
It's that recognition of immortality, perceiving oneself as a spirit or ghost, acknowledges the eternal nature of consciousness beyond the physical body. There's this freedom from material attachments because the identification and association is as a non-corporate being that can be liberated from material attachments and earthly concerns, maybe in the sense of allowing for one's spiritual growth and transcendence, as in the kamikaze, as in the crucifixion. And it makes me wonder if recognizing the eternal nature of consciousness beyond the physical body can lead to a deeper understanding of mortality and transcendence, because most of what I see is taught is that the liberation from material attachment seems to be essential for spiritual growth and enlightenment. We have to have feet on the ground and a head that looks towards the sky. And we have to be grounded on the earth and have the rationality. Otherwise, we're up in the clouds and there is no grounding. It's a bit like putting a tent up. We have to secure the tent to the ground, but we also have to be aware of the infinite spaces around it. Otherwise, we're putting a ladder against the wall without securing its base.
We've talked about this in a somewhat negative context, the Christians being eaten by the lions and the kamikazes, but which I hasten to add, most people who meditate are at this level. And also an awful lot of people who pray. They realize they are a spiritual being, and so they have some communion with higher powers. They are not terrified of death because they realize the body is frail and it gets old and it's broken down, and after a while you want to get rid of it. So this is a very large group of people. 80% of Americans aver a belief in angels. But beyond that, what do we really mean by an angel? Angel comes from the Greek word for messenger, because in the Bible, the angel was the messenger. That's congruent with the Greco-Roman god Hermes. He was the messenger of the gods. How is that any different? Now, so it's basically a free being. We have an idea of an angel as being benign, benevolent, lacking in malice, and that is congruent with being very causative, above the middle of the scale, which tells you a lot about why people are destructive. People are destructive because they are at effect. So if you go into a prison, you'll find all these people had no father, grew up in poverty, went to a horrible school, never got any help with their homework, dropped out of high school. So that's effect. As opposed to people who are causative. Yes, I was able to get high grades. Yes, I was able to get into a good college. Yes, I was able to graduate with honors. That's being causative. This is a gradation from the lowest consciousness, which is thinking you are an object, all the way up to the highest consciousness, which is infinity. There are people who can attain levels 1, 2, and 3 as humans. In other words, you don't necessarily have to be a god in the sense of Zeus or Mercury or Aphrodite to be at level 2. You can have that level of cognition. Level 1, 2, and 3 are beings who not only realize they're spiritual, but they have a higher level of identity, a higher level of causativeness. If you study angels, and you have to realize that angels are recognized not only all around the world, but all the way through history. They're just called different things. You could make a very good case that all of the Greco-Roman gods, all of the Norse gods, and all these other systems of gods, they're describing angels. In terms of just looking at it objectively, you could say, how is Aphrodite not an angel? So the Greco-Roman tradition did not have the word angel. That was brought in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So it's a semantic issue. but the Japanese use the word kami, meaning spirit. Angels are the jinn of the Arabian culture. Okay, they're describing angels. If you don't get hung up in what you might call religious identity politics, it's easy to see how many people acknowledge this and are aware of this globally throughout history. Any questions before we move on?
I think those angelic structures are ubiquitous throughout our history, our Earth history, and probably beyond. I can see that level 3, in the lowest common denominator, there can be a potential for hubris because you can believe oneself to be an angel, which may lead to a sense of superiority or entitlement, potentially causing harm through misguided actions or beliefs. So there can be a disconnect from humanity because the view of oneself as a free being may potentially result in a detachment from human struggles and emotions, hindering empathy and compassion towards others. Whereas the highest common factor, identifying as an angel or a free being, could signify alignment with higher spiritual forces and a commitment to serving the greater good. It's really perceiving oneself as a powerful free spirit because one's actions are guided by divine principles.
You actually described Satan in that paragraph. The whole story of the fallen angel. The fallen angels would prefer to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. That's the whole rationale,
Right.
the whole story of Satan. You just described it perfectly. An angel is basically a free being. So he's a being that doesn't need a body because he realizes it's superfluous. Above this is when you go up to the level of a god. We get into a lot of semantic problems here. We're talking about the divine level, a being who thinks of himself as a god. There are many people who, through meditation or facilitation, can attain a godlike state where they think of themselves as a god. They think of themselves as a divine being, even beyond an angel. I think it's Hinduism, they talk about getting back to the Godhead. That is what they are saying. Getting to level 2 is getting back to the Godhead.
Inside of that Godhead, there's the narrative that usually runs is about wisdom, compassion, and divine qualities, the embodiment of divine qualities, and co-creation with the universe. Perceiving oneself as divine acknowledges the interconnectedness of all things and one's role in co-creating the universe through thought and intention. The lower end of it is we can believe oneself to be a god. And you've exampled this in previous conversations of certain people who believe themselves to be this omnipresent sort of God where they're infallible and it leads to arrogance and a disregard for the perspectives and experiences of others. And I think there are ethical dilemmas associated with that because if we assume that role of a divine being and exercise power and influence over others without taking responsibility of the consequences of one's actions.
Okay, now remember, level 5 is an identity. A person can have the identity, a god. That is megalomania, as opposed to actually being at level 2. Now, you have to realize when you talk about the divine traits, this is causativeness. So what this is telling you is that the upscale beings are causative and the low scale beings are not. This is what you see in society. A person who's very causative is going to be fairly high on this scale. The more causative he is, the higher he's going to be on the scale. A god is very causative, right? A god says, let there be light, and there's light. At the bottom, you have somebody saying, there is no God, there is no spirit. So this tells you a lot about the person you're dealing with. My observation in using this scale, which I've had long before I had the idea of Septemics, I've had this scale most of my adult life. I'll look at a person, and it doesn't matter if he has a doctorate or some kind of a title as a reverend. He can still be at a low level on this scale, and that's really scary. Those are scary people. So you have to be able to have enough insight to look at this person and say, where is this person on this scale? But that's true for all of the scales. So that is why one of the axioms is that using this book requires some insight, but also develops insight. So every time you correctly spot anyone on any scale, it's because your insight improved. You said, oh, I see what's going on with Fred. He's at level 4 on this scale. That's insight. So you're developing insight. The more you use the system, the more insight you have. And so it generally tends to push you up, which goes into another axiom, which is that being at or near the top of any scale is both a cause and an effect of being at or near the top of any other scale. And being at or near the bottom of any scale is both a cause and an effect of being at or near the bottom of any other scale. And so you have generally downscale people and generally upscale people. So you can see this demographically. If you were to, for example, go through a terrorist group, you're going to find that those people are at or near the bottom of the scale. Now, it's not uniform, but remember, a person can have the identity of God or an angel or an avatar. It's an identity. It's not really how the person thinks of himself, which is what the scale is about. Let me explain. A God is still separate. He's saying, I'm here and you're there. When you go to level 1, infinity, there is an embracing of everything because that's what infinity is. In other words, if a being were to go down the scale, he would start out at the level of infinity. I am all things and everyone. And then he would differentiate himself and say, those guys are bad. I'm a god. Now he's at level 2. Those guys are the bad guys. That's a lower level of identity. And then if he goes down from that, he's not a god anymore. He can't say, let there be light, but he's still a free being. And if he would go down further, he would think of himself as a spirit. And whether or not he's corporeal, he still thinks of himself as a spirit, even though he's not angelic. I can tell you that many people, millions of people, have communicated with angels. If you study the literature on it and have any type of this experience yourself, you'll see that angels have a mind. They think. When you get up to a god, the mind becomes somewhat diffuse. In other words, you are so at cause that your mind embraces everything. And then when you get up to the top of the scale, you're close to total cause. And so you embrace everything, which is what infinity is. Infinity or eternity. A person, whether or not he's in a body, can think of himself as infinite. If you study, for example, the Hindu texts, they say that the whole point of life is to resolve your karma so that you can go back up the scale. So the reason you reincarnate is that you have karma to resolve.
The Buddhists talk about the 5 kleshas. They talk about resolving those things. They permeate all religions, but it's dressed up in a very different manner.
Yes, it's a cultural issue. Dressed up in a different manner. That's really a good way to explain it. And that's a lot of what this book is trying to get past. By discovering these phenomena, I got down to the fundamental fact that determine the strata at which humans operate across 35 axes. That is why the hardest part of this was expressing it in a way that would make sense to the average reader. Now, as I have pointed out, people who are at or near the bottom of these scales are not going to read this book. And even if they did read it, they wouldn't understand it. And even if they did understand it, they would never apply it because it violates their basic way of life. If a guy's in the Russian mob, his life is about stealing things and killing people. So that is a very low level. That person is going to be, if we're talking about this scale, maybe at level 6. So it's easy for him to justify this. I can recall as a small boy, because I grew up in a religious context, there were things I was taught to do and things not to do. For example, thou shalt not steal, 10 commandments, right? There are a lot of little kids who steal things, but I would say, if I were to steal that cookie, God would see me doing that. And so I'm not going to do it. So you see, that's like in the mind of a little kid. That's a spiritual awareness of being motivated to not do something that he has been taught is wrong because there's some spiritual reality of it. See, people who are murderers and rapists and terrorists and oppressors, they're at or near the bottom of these scales. They're like they say, there is no God. Because there's no God, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to be punished for anything bad that I do. He has a very low level of insight. A person who is more causative is going to be higher on this scale. I think it was James Madison who famously said, if men were angels, government would not be necessary, but men are not angels. So you have to realize that the founding fathers were, whether or not they were Christians, some of them weren't, some of them were deists, they still had this concept of spiritual identity. Jefferson, for example, was clearly a deist. There's no ambiguity about that. He was not a Christian, although he clearly had a spiritual identity. So I'm sure that when the founding fathers died, they realized this body is old and worn out, and I'm not going to go away. Maybe they thought they would go to heaven. Maybe they thought they would reincarnate. Who knows what they thought? That gets into different religions. But the point is, does a person have a spiritual identity or not? So the whole point of all these scales is that it is the full spectrum. You could make an argument that a person who is at level 1 doesn't have a spiritual identity because he's everything. And identity is an inherently solipsistic concept. Similarly, if a being thinks he's an animate object, is there really any spiritual identity there? He's not up to even having the idea of a spirit. He's just being a rock. The problem with this book, more than anything else, was how do I say this in a way that makes sense to people? Now, it would have been easy for me to say it in an abstruse academic way that would have, strictly speaking, been more correct. But my motivation was to make this accessible to the general reading public. So there's a trade-off there. For example, you could say infinity level 1, isn't that divine? Yes, but this is even beyond divine because a god still separates himself. See, for example, in the Greco-Roman context, Aphrodite had one sphere, Neptune had another sphere, and so forth. Whereas when you get up to level 1, there's only one sphere, and it is you. So it is kind of embracing all things, which is something that Alan Watts talks about in his many lectures. He was a Protestant minister who later studied Buddhism and a variety of other religions. He says, you are all these things. See, that is looking at everything from one, infinity.
It's that ultimate unity and oneness, perceiving oneself as infinity, because there's the ultimate realization of unity and oneness with all things, which transcends the limitations of individual identity and ego. When we identify with infinity, that unleashes a limitless potential and creativity. You then become a co-creator of reality in harmony with the divine. Because
Right.
isn't the realization of unity and oneness with all things the ultimate goal of spiritual enlightenment?
Here's the rub. If you have a viewpoint, I am infinity, that means you are also Jesus, you're Buddha, Ananda, but you're also Hitler and Stalin and Charles Starkweather, who murdered 12 people in 10 days in 1957. You are all of that. But when you go from 1 to 2, duality enters the picture. You say, I am a God. See, you're not everything, you're divine. There is separation. That is clear when you study Greco-Roman and Norse theology. These beings have separation between them. So there's the god of grain and the god of love and the god of the sea, et cetera, et cetera. So clearly that's not infinite, but it's still a god, which is beyond an angel. The reason that angels are messengers to humans is that they are similar enough to humans that they could be messengers. So if you communicate with an angel, you'll see that they have minds, they have personalities. In fact, they have karma. An angel still has some karma. He has a lot less karma. You see, the scale of cause. So as you get rid of the karma, you go up the scale, you become more causative. Your karma is what causes you to be the way you are, which is a Hindu concept.
Which is really choices and consequences.
Yes, and that is why the Hindus have this idea. This guy was born into a poor, ignorant family. Okay, that's his karma. He chose that. So that's a very different view from the Western view of karma. Oh, let's all feel sorry for this poor person who was born in poverty. The Hindus would say he didn't have to be born into that family. He could have been born one of the children of Elon Musk. This is a scale that is not going to make a lot of sense to people who are at or near the bottom of this scale, but that could be said of any scale.
I love all the scales, all the ones we've covered so far, especially with this particular scale. There are a myriad of arguments that can offer insight into the complexities and implications of each level of spirituality, which invites further reflection and exploration into the nature of spiritual beingness and into the nature of consciousness. At level one, what comes to my mind is there is a universal camera. This is where karma comes in. By the choices we make and the consequences of those choices, you are known and marked for those choices and consequences. It's something I'm really looking at in terms of the arguments, complexities, and implications of these different levels of spirituality.
The best way to think about this is in terms of causativeness. So take somebody like Stephen Hawking, right, who got this horrible disease that made him basically a basket case for half of his life. A Hindu or a Buddhist would say it's his karma. That is what we are looking into when we get into facilitation and meditation. What's going on? Why am I doing this? Why is this happening to me? As you elevate yourself to a higher level of insight, it's because you are more causative. If a person is saying, oh, those people who have abortions are evil and they're all going to go to hell. So that person is really separated from those people, right? That person is not being causative at all about that group that he decries. A person at a higher level of causativeness would say, this person made this choice. Maybe I won't make that choice, but there's no hatred there. So you see that hatred corresponds to effect and love corresponds to cause, because it's a cliche to say God is love, because when you are infinite, you embrace everything.
If you're into the cause worlds, it goes cause, process, effect, or cause, process, results. Most people are in touch with the effects or the results of something without understanding the process and
Right.
the cause world. So we tend to look
Right.
at the outcome and the effect and
Right.
then interact with that as distinct from, and we see this in the medical profession as an example. In some departments, now I'm not disparaging the medical profession in any way, but there are some that don't look at the cause worlds, they
Right.
look at the result, and therefore you get the ceremonial declaration to leave, which is the prescription that they write for you.
Yeah, and so let me just give you a tiny little shred of something that I used as a human development engineer. So somebody would be complaining about somebody, like the guy says, oh, my wife is really not a good wife. She doesn't keep the house clean. She bounces check. She doesn't pay attention to the kids. So I will usually try to get something specific from the guy, get down to something discreet. My wife is not a good mate. Then I would say to the guy, did you ever do anything like that yourself? And 99% of the time, I'll say, now that you mention it, yeah. And so instead of being at effect of his wife, he's assuming some causation because he caused that effect too. And 99% of the time, when somebody is complaining like that, is because he himself did it. If he had no culpability in it, he would have a benign attitude. He would say, yeah, it's true. She burns the toast and she is late making dinner, but I love her anyway. See, and that's where the session would end up if you use that question. Did you ever do that yourself? That goes, again, that's making the person cause. See, so there's a technique that I have been using since I was a young man, which is that anytime anything goes wrong, on any level, I always say, what did I do to make that happen? Sometimes it doesn't come to me right away. Sometimes it takes weeks for me to say, oh, I see what I did. I never should have asked her out in the first place. That's what I did that was wrong. See, what that does is it gets you to realize that you are at cause. It pushes you up the scale.
And you have to build that muscle. If you go into the gym, there may be a weight on the bar that you think, I can't lift that. It's not the fact you cannot lift it. It's just that you're not strong enough yet because you haven't given it the time or the energy or the focus to be able to be at cause so you can have the effect that you want. That's so important to build that density that promotes the trajectory of your destiny.
That's the power of positive thinking. Henry Ford famously said, whether you think you can or think you can't, you're right. So obviously, every bit of wisdom that has ever been propounded can be misused and misunderstood by misguided people. So you have to put all of those things in context for what it is. But still, the whole point of moving up the scale is you get to a higher level of causativeness. And so your identity changes. And don't think that people are going to like you because of that. It doesn't work that way. Why do you think they crucified Jesus and St. Paul and St. Peter and all the other martyrs? Why? See, they were at a high level on the scale, but people at a low level on the scale hated them for it, because that is what hate is. Hate is an effect. So you carry around this effect that we call hatred, and then you use it to motivate doing bad things to good people. If you are so craven that you're more concerned about the moment or the consequence of the moment, that means you're at a lower level on the scale. You know, like Nathan Hale, who was one of Washington's spies, was caught by the British. And upon the gallows, they said, do you have any last thing you want to say before we hang you? And he said, yes, I regret that I have but one life to give for my country. So this was obviously a guy who had some spiritual idea. He probably was a Christian because most of the people in the colonies were at that time. And he had some sense that he was a spirit, that go ahead and kill me. That's what you guys do. And what is it that Jesus said upon the cross? This day you will be with me in paradise, he said to one of the criminals next to him. Remember, there were two. One of them was a naysayer, and the other one is the one who said, this man prays for the people who torture him. And then he said to him, this day you will be with me in paradise. There's a lot of profundity in the scale, and it's, in a sense, the simplicity of the scale kind of works against understanding it, because the fact that I've broken this down to 7 levels, which is an engineering function, makes it difficult to realize how much profundity goes into this. All of the global theology, all of the global philosophy fits into this rubric. So you could study your whole life, 24 hours a day for 100 years, and not cover all of the theology and all of the philosophy that we already have propounded on Earth in the last 6,000 years. There's just too much of it. But what you can do is you can study enough of it to have insight, to say, oh, I see these guys are doing the same thing that these guys are doing. They're just calling it a different thing. See?
Can you also re-emphasize the caveat of not telling anybody where they are on a scale?
Every opportunity I have, I say, do not tell anyone, any living person, the level of any other living person on any scale. It's counterproductive and unethical. I went through a lot of trouble to make these scales accessible. So it's much better to just show the guy the scale and say to him, where are you on this scale? Now, if he has no clue, that tells you he's at or near the bottom. There's a certain percentage of people who are at or near the bottom. And they'll just say, this is gobbledygook, it doesn't make any sense to me, get it out of here, and throw the book at you. So that's what you get from those people. This book isn't for those people anyway. One of the axioms of this subject is Septemics is for people who want to improve oneself or one's life. That obviously does not include terrorists, torturers, professional criminals, narcissists. Those people aren't interested in improving themselves or others. That's why they're that way. My calculation is that about half the human race fits into that bracket. They want to improve themselves and others. Those are the people to whom this book is directed. So somebody who looks at this book and opens it up to the scale says, oh, this is cool. See, tells me right there, he's not at or near the bottom of the scale. Because if he were, he wouldn't see it that way. He would say, this is just garbage. Get out of here with this stuff. See? So yes, never tell anybody your level. Now, if you have a spouse and you are very close to that spouse, you might consider telling the person your level, but that would be like the deepest, the darkest secret you could divulge to somebody is your level on the scale. That's far more intimate to taking off your clothes and getting in bed. That's just something you do with your body. Telling the person who you are as a being, that's risky. And as I said, it's also counterproductive and unethical. So the way I think of this is I had some training in boxing. So I'm going to box somebody who's like my size, right? That's the rule. People beyond a certain size, they're not allowed to box me. They're too big, right? So if I'm going to box somebody who I outweigh by 30 pounds, that's not boxing. That's mayhem. So that's the way I look at this. I have this power, this septemic power, where I can look at a person and in seconds I can say, I see this guy is at this level on this scale. I don't tell that to anyone. I keep it to myself. But now I understand. It's just if I go into a flower shop and say, oh, chrysanthemums, that's nice. Over here, they have tulips. They're nice too. I know what it is. That's the whole point of knowing. And knowing is the most important word that's not on this scale. Because if you study all of the theological texts, they say God is omniscient. From which Calvin said, if God is omniscient, he knows that before you're born, what kind of a life you're going to have, what suffering you're going to experience, whether you're going to go to heaven. Now, of course, a lot of people rejected that. That's what they call predestination. And you're really getting into philosophy here on stuff like that. The whole point of insight. What is insight? Insight is knowing. Now, most people cannot separate knowing from understanding from opinion. They are three completely separate things. For example, if you say, do you know who the president is? I say, I understand the president is Biden. I don't really know that. See, that's the reports that I have. So I understand that. But if you say, how about the Pythagorean theorem? I say, that I know. See, that's knowable. That is a different level of cognition. So that is what insight is. There's that moment when you see the formula for a circle and you say, oh, I see. This is beautiful, the formula for a circle. See? And you have that insight into it. That is knowledge. That is what education is supposed to do. So that has nothing to do with indoctrination. It has nothing to do with job training. It has nothing to do with status. It's all about, I can have thousands of experiences sitting in class and the teacher's lecturing, and I have this epiphany. Oh, now I see what this was about. See, it's knowledge. You are drawing the person out, which is what the word educate means. Yeah. Drawing the person out. And he knows this thing. He has some knowledge of the Napoleonic age or the Age of Enlightenment. These are like big concepts. There's a lot in there, as opposed to just having some facts. Columbus discovered America in 1492. That's just a data point. But you have to really get into, well, what was going on? What was the age of exploration? Why was an Italian sent by the Spaniards to the New World?
I remember doing workshops, and I would go into a workshop with 80 people and say, when was the Battle of Hastings? They would say, oh, 1066. Right. I would say, okay, what do you know about the Battle of Hastings? Deafening silence. Because the first remedy is knowing, is having that understanding of the cause of what created that battle, and having a much more of a deeper penetration and permeation coding of that experience, as distinct from treating the brain as good memory storage data that you can vomit out when somebody asks you a question.
So that is why when you look at a level, right? Let's say you have this guy and he's behaving a certain way. So you inspect this person and then you look at the scale and you say, I see. This guy's at level 5 on the scale of choice. That's an epiphany. That's an insight. You know that. That is another reason why you don't tell anybody else. The guy you're talking to probably doesn't know that. Now, can he know it? Yes. You say, oh, you have qualms about Frank? Here, look at this scale, the scale of choice. Where is he on this scale? See? And you might act as a tutor without telling him, get him to look at it and see, oh, yeah, I see this guy's at level 5. Now, at that point, you might smile and nod, and he knows that when you know that he knows, but nobody said it. And there's nothing wrong with that. That goes on all the time. But that is the whole point of spiritual identity. You look at a person and you have to have some insight into this person. What is knowable about this person? Can you know who this person is? The problem with human society is that most people have opinion and belief mixed up with knowing. Opinions are like belly buttons. Everybody has one.
That's not what Clint Eastwood said. Didn't say what he said, but I think you
Right.
get it.
So anyway, that is important in understanding this. Cause is a very high level concept. A person who is opinionated is at effect. A person who knows is not at effect. He's a cause. So it becomes part of you. That is what polymathy is about for me. It's about becoming causative in all of these different areas. I see where physics fits in. I see where chemistry fits in. I see how biology fits in, and they all become one big thing in my mind, which is knowledge. Now, that doesn't mean I can recite for you with specificity the exact content of the periodic table of elements, although there was a time when I could do that when I was a chemistry student. That is not the point. Knowing all the little details is not as important as having insight in the area. So when I listen to a brilliant speaker like Stephen Wolfram or even Elon Musk, I can have their insights. I see what you're talking about here. That is education, becoming more causative. And that is what you need to use this skill. See, how do you communicate with an angel? Okay, it's all done telepathic. What is that? That's knowingness.
If you instruct your faculty in all these different areas, then it provides a loom. It weaves this loom. I love psychology. I love human behavior, but I also look at other aspects of things like physics, which I don't pretend to understand, but I look at that and draw analogies and different aspects of physics and draw them into psychology, and then look at spirituality, look at the science of
Right.
spirituality. And I'm not a polymath like you are, but it's my attempt to say there's this lattice work where all these things start to integrate. I remember at school, I would take one thing and get 100 things from it. And my teacher
Uh-huh.
would say to me, yeah, but that's not the curricula. You've got to focus
Mm-hmm.
on this. I'd say, yeah, but what about this and this? Because that intersects in some way. That's why I
Right.
was never good at exams, because the question for me had a depth to it. I could see a depth within it. And it was
Right.
like Peter must learn to follow the curricula and not go off on a tangent. Whereas to me, it wasn't a tangent. It was the very fact that we're looking at different strands that weaves a tapestry that allows you to get a much fuller picture, so I can get a deeper penetration and a better purchase on the subject, as distinct from, oh, it's 1066.
Right. And the point I'm just trying to make here is you have to come to this scale with a sense of knowingness.
Mm,
If you are an opinionated person, this scale is not going to work for you. And you see this all the time. People who embrace certain religions to the exclusion of all others.
mm.
They're actually very negative. You are bad because you're not a Christian. You're going to go to hell. That is a very unenlightened approach. It's an effect approach. That
Yeah.
person is an effect, as opposed to a person who is causative can say, I can see what the Hindus are saying here, and I can see what the Jainists are saying here, and I can see what the Baha'i faith people are saying, and fit it all in and not attack any of it.
This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for your insights. I really appreciate you and appreciate you putting this together. And in one way, I see this as a simplicity, but with a huge amount of profundity. I could spend a lifetime on this. What I'm seeing in these scales is you've provided us with a rational title for these scales in order to pursue what I see as the irrational, but it's something I can hang my hat on. I'm getting this insight. Oh, okay, I'm
Right,
getting this insight. May not be immediate, but I need the rationality initially, the earth aspect of it, my feet on the ground, but also the sky aspect of it, so I can look
right.
into the sky, but I need to remain grounded.
If I were not a polymathic scholar with a hard science background, I never would have been able to figure the scale out because I took the largest possible concept, spiritual identity and stratified it into 7 levels. So that's filtering the wisdom of the ages through the mind of an engineer. And this is what you get.
It's beautiful, Jim. Absolutely beautiful. It's poetry in motion. It really is. Where can people find you, Jim?
As far as Septemics, I invite them to my website, which you'll find very informative, where it's septemics.com, Septemics, and you can see what people have said about this, what journalists have written about it, what the reviews are. You can read sections of the book itself. There's now an article there, which you can read, which sort of explains the whole thing, if you like reading, in one essay about what it is, what this is, what Septemics is. Or if you prefer listening, you can listen to a recording of me explaining it in 15 minutes, what Septemics is. And the whole idea is that your success is my reward. So I want people to use this and have better lives.
Thank you so much, Jim, once again, and look forward to the next scale.
Okay, see you next week.